All right, next up, Mr. Carlos Polop. Martin, the hacking content creation with Halborn. Okay, Carlos has a degree in telecommunications engineering with a master's in cybersecurity. He has worked mainly as a penetration tester and red teamer for several companies, but also a developer and system administrator. He is here today talking about the cloud, a game changer for red teaming and privacy. Please help me welcome my friend, Carlos.
Cool. So, well, thank you everybody for being here. This is the talk we are going to be doing now, Cloud, a game changer for red teaming and privacy. Okay, so I know there is a lot of different kind of technical levels here, and if you know me, I used to do a lot of demos during this presentation, but in this case, I'm gonna be keeping it simple and going to the idea on how a red team has changed now that a lot of companies have moved to cloud. We are not talking anymore about internal networks. We are not talking anymore about Active Directory. We are talking about API keys. We are talking about AWS, third-party platforms, SaaS providers such as GitHub, GitLab, and any other third-party platform that companies are start using. And then I want to do a little note about privacy, because something companies I feel like are forgetting when they move to cloud is privacy, or the lack of privacy in these kind of environments. So, my name is Carlos Polop. I do hacking content creator. I write hack tricks, piece, but I also dedicate to pentest and red team. I'm a cloud infra, web app, mobile application team lead in Halborn, a Web3 company from here, from the States. Pentester, red team. I was captain of the Spanish team in the European Cybersecurity Challenge in 2021. I'm member of the winning team Europe last year, so it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I'm also an author of a lot of open source tools. So if you don't know about Hacktricks, this is a free book that is available on the internet in book.hacktricks.com.xyz, and it will give you a lot of hints about hacking techniques in a lot of different fields. Where it's basically where I write everything that I learn, and I know that a lot of pen testers use it. And of course, you can follow me in Twitter in hacktricks_live. So this is what we are going to be talking about. We are going to be talking about the red team cyber kill chain, what is red team going, the different phases, and then we are going to be getting a little bit more in depth about some of the phases like discovery, internal enumeration, IAM privilege escalation, or compromise. I'm going to be trying to compare these new red team exercises in cloud with traditional ones. So for example, when we talk about organization compromise in AWS, we are comparing it with a domain controller compromise in Active Directory. Then we will talk about post-exploitation and some very fun profits you can do when you compromise an AWS account that I'm sure you're gonna like. And finally, we are going to be doing this note about privacy in the cloud. Okay, so I'm pretty sure more of you are already familiar with this kind of circle where you see the different steps you need to do for a process in cybersecurity. Privately, I like these steps for a red team, where you start doing some enumeration, some discovery. You know that you need to attack this company. You start using some OSINT techniques. You start doing some web enumeration, some vulnerability research. You dedicate a lot of time. And when we talk about AWS, you need to do other stuff, some different stuff than when you're talking about a traditional enterprise. We'll talk about that. Once you find a vulnerability or some leak or something that gives you some access to the AWS account or to the internal network in a traditional company, you will exploit it and you wear your foothold. And this is when the fun starts. This is when the fun starts because you start doing some manual internal enumeration. You figure out how it's working internally. Once you know how it's working, that you start doing things such as post-exploitation. Maybe you can get more credentials. Maybe you can access more sensitive information. You do some persistence if you have enough permissions. And you escalate privileges, well, if you have enough permissions or know you find other vulnerabilities to escalate privileges. This wheel is going to stop spinning once you have compromised everything, once you don't know what else to do, or when you're doing a red team, once you have compromised the information that you wanted to access. Remember that during a red team or a cyber terrorist, attack, you don't need to compromise everything. You just need to get access to the information you're interested in. So don't focus always in compromising everything. Focus on finding this sensitive information you were looking for. Once you stop, you will start doing the profit and maybe removing logs if that's something you need to do in the red team scenario. So discovery and enumeration. This is going to be probably the most similar topic related to traditional red team attacks. You're going to start looking for the exposure of the company to the internet. You're going to start looking for domains, subdomains, web application, IP addresses, vulnerabilities. But in case of cloud providers, you're going to be looking a lot for things such as Git leaks. And this is incredible because you will think that, hey, I'm going to the cloud, this is going to be more secure. But actually, in my experience, a lot of companies are going to be having simple credentials leak in their GitHub. And remember that AWS, for example, AWS API is accessible by everybody. So if you find maybe some database credentials from an internal network, you still need to find a foothold inside that internal network in order to use these credentials. If you find credentials for AWS, you can just use it right away. So I have this funny story where I was doing this red teaming to a company. I couldn't find any leaks, and then I started looking for Git leaks inside the workers' personal GitHub spaces. And I found administrator access to an AWS account of the co-founder of the company. This co-founder had a lot of other web applications that I used for a watering hole attack to get credentials for the other workers, because of course they are going to be trusting the web application of their boss. So it was as stupid as this to manage to get other credentials and compromise the company. Also, traditionally, I'm sure you know about these open buckets. You can find them via spidering and brute forcing. Traditionally, when cloud started, this was a big deal because a lot of companies misconfigured this, and you could access sensitive information. You could have write access over these pages. Imagine that you have some JavaScript files in an S3 bucket, and you can write over it. We are talking here about changing that and exfiltrating credentials of other users. And I'm just talking about new exposure that cloud is providing red teamers, that you didn't have before in traditional environments, such as internal networks, because you wouldn't be exposing these open buckets in internal networks. And then you can do just traditional stuff, such as searching for open ports, exploits, brute force credentials, web. If you don't know about the vulnerability, server-side requires forgery. This is a great way to get more credentials inside cloud providers that wouldn't be that useful if you find it in a traditional network. And then we have even more exposure with these cloud settings. We have public AMIs, we have EBS snapshots, RDS snapshots, roles and usernames enumeration inside AWS without any kind of access, Cognito credentials. Cognito is this great AWS service that could provide you AWS access without having any other access over the platform. So it's great if you find it misconfigured. And federated identities. One of 3 companies I usually check that is using GitHub and AWS, I can compromise their company because they are opening some iron role to all GitHub. Man, cloud is not more secure than traditional infrastructure. It's not going to be more secure. The only difference between cloud and traditional infrastructure is that hackers aren't being specialized yet in cloud. Once they get specialized, this is going to blow up. So I just want you to know this, like cloud is not limiting the exposure of companies, cloud is making it bigger. Just so you know. So let's continue. Imagine that somehow we found some Cognito misconfiguration, we managed to leak some Cognito credentials, we now have access to an AWS account. This is where the fun part starts. If we remember the wheel, enumeration, exploitation, we are going to the internal enumeration. And this is probably when things get a little bit different and harder from traditional networks. This is because in a traditional network, you usually will be finding this Active Directory, and just with some credentials, you are going to be able to run Bloodhound, enumerate everything, find paths to escalate privilege, to compromise everything. In AWS, because we are focusing in AWS, by default, you don't have any privilege. So you are not going to be able to know what is happening unless you were given explicit permissions to know that. So if you want to start enumeration, the enumeration internally, you can just go to the web console. You can launch automatic tools. This is going to be super noisy. I don't recommend it for a red team unless you don't know what else to do. My recommendation will be to follow with the AWS CLI and run some common enumeration tricks with this AWS CLI API and check what you can do as stealth as possible. And also check these tools I have written to figure out exactly this question. What can I do in this account? So we have things such as brute force permissions. If you don't have any other way to find out permissions, you just brute force them and find out if you can do it. My recommendation is, this is a stealth, this is kind of a stealth, but you need to enumerate them very slowly. We are talking here maybe about running this brute force tool for 1 or 2 days, so people don't get caught. And this is because usually when you are using some CM, you don't care about requests that are brute forcing if you have read access. You care if you have a lot of requests at the same time. Maybe if you try to access 10 different permissions in less than 10 seconds, you're going to get caught. If you do that in 5 minutes, you're not going to get caught because it is not that important. So we can still brute force in a stealth way. It's just going to take a lot of time. Think about this like a very slow Nmap, but for AWS permissions. But of course, there are other things that we could do. So in AWS, we have this very specific permission that will allow you to go to AWS and say, hey, can I do this? So if you have this specific permission, you can brute force faster. You're going to be using a permission you have, and you will be able to enumerate everything. We have another tool. Of course, everything here is free. You can go to GitHub and access it. And another 2 very cool techniques that I like is, okay, it's quite common to find AWS credentials when you find your entry point with read access over the buckets. Could it be any interesting information in these buckets that could allow us to respond the question, what can I do? And actually, in a lot of cases, I found that there are. So CloudTrail is the AWS service that is going to be generating logs of everything what a user is doing, what a principal is doing inside AWS. So if you have read access over these logs, you can just see what the credentials you installed did in the past. So you know what you can do based on what has happened in the past. And here we are talking only about dumping some files that you have access to. So it's going to be very stealth, and you're going to be knowing what you can do. And my favorite one by far is the TF-Safe to IAM tool. This basically is very similar to the CloudTrail wall, but we are going to be reading the Terraform state files. If you don't know what this is, you should know, definitely. Terraform state is the logs about Terraform, about how is the infrastructure being built. You can find anything there. You can find, in AWS, you can find every role, every permission, every user, every tiny piece of infrastructure and relation that you have in AWS. So of course, you're going to be able to know all the permissions of everyone just by reading this file. And also, these files always contain sensitive credentials. So if you find a TST file that you can read anywhere, you have highly probably compromised the whole organization, because there are always secrets in these files. If you don't know about this, of course, there is more information about Terraform in Cloud Hack Tree, so take a look, because it's very, very interesting, and it's a very easy way to escalate privilege. You know, in Active Directory, usually you run Bloodhound and you find this path and you are now domain admin. In AWS, there are going to be other very, very easy paths that usually contains, hey, I can just read this file with sensitive credentials, now I'm administrator. So always look for these low-hanging fruits. Privilege escalation, there are tens of hundreds of different ways to escalate privilege in AWS. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can just follow this link and find, a lot of privilege escalation techniques. One of them could be just having this permission, IAM create access key, that will allow you to create API keys of other users in AWS. So you could just create the keys and escalate privilege to this user. So let's continue with our task. We found these cognito credentials, we compromised it, we enumerated, we found out that we have this permission, we escalated to administrator because we create an API key to administrator. Now let's talk about how we can compromise the whole AWS organization. Well, by default, in AWS, you create your first account. Let's think how a company that is starting to use AWS will think, okay? So you create your AWS account, and you just want to start using AWS as soon as possible. You start using S3 buckets, you start using virtual machines, containers, lambdas, everything in the account you have just created. And then your company matures, and you say, hey, Like, we shouldn't be doing everything in the same account. We shouldn't be having production, development, staging in the same account. Let's separate it. So you start creating your AWS organization, and you separate production, you separate development, you separate staging, and you create other researching accounts. But you never stop using the root one, because who has time to completely move everything and refactor everything? So there is always something that is going to be running in the root account, in the first account. So if an attacker, for some reason, managed to compromise this first account, you need to know that the other children accounts will have a role that is called Organization Account Access Role, giving administrator access to this first account. So this is exactly as what will happen in Active Directory. We have compromised one of the main accounts, and now because of the trust they have, we can just compromise every other thing with administrator access. That's why AWS always recommend this first account, don't use it for anything. You just use it to create other accounts and run everything in the other accounts. Unfortunately, most of the companies I see in the wild, they won't be following this, and I will always find stuff being running this first account that will compromise your entire organization. Cool, post-exploitation and persistence. So imagine that, okay, we have compromised everything, we have administrator access. You could be using this administrator access, for example, stealing GitHub credentials from Codebill, or we can use this administrator access to gain persistence using Lambda layers persistence, for example. This is a very stealth one that I haven't seen anyone talking that much in the wild. Take a look to this link if you're interested in the technical details, because it's, well, both are amazing techniques, and there are a lot of different techniques in AWS for that. But I want to move forward to profit. The most common way to do, I don't support doing any of these things without permissions, so I'm not encouraging you, but you really need to know how cyber criminals could be doing this. So crypto mining is the favorite one, because it's the easiest way to transform computing power into money. You can also dump everything and ask for a ransomware, but my favorite technique for profit is going to be to abuse KMS AWS service, which is the service that is used for management keys in AWS, cryptographic keys. I also call it ransomware as a service in AWS. Why? Because you can go to all these AWS keys, change the permissions, and say, hey, I'm an attacker, you are controlling these keys, now I am in control of these keys. My attacker's AWS account is going to be controlling your AWS keys. And the web console will tell you, hey, you cannot do this because your account is going to be losing access to these keys. You cannot do that. So you go to AWS CLI, you use this parameter bypass policy local safety check, and now you can do this. And what you could do is, imagine you have these gigabytes of sensitive information of a company in an S3 bucket encrypted with a KMS key. You just say, hey, now this KMS key belongs to me. Not even the higher privileged user in the company is going to be able to access those keys, only the attacker. So with one API call, you just cause a complete ransomware in the AWS infrastructure. This is a ransomware as a service in AWS. To be honest, I have never seen this being used in the wild. It's a technique I just found out while researching, and I don't know if AWS will try to help you to recover in those access, but just so you know that you could definitely be doing this. And finally, I will talk a little bit, a couple of minutes about privacy in the cloud, because I think this is a very interesting topic. Nowadays, we have all the companies moving to the cloud, and I don't know if they are really considering the privacy bit. So the first thing that when you ask someone that is privacy aware of the cloud, he's going to tell you this: the cloud is just someone else's computer. If we fix this sentence, this is a very sophisticated computer. Like, it's incredible what you can do in cloud. It's incredible. It's incredible how easy it is, how fast you can deploy anything. It's amazing. But this is someone else's computer. Your things are going to be running in another person's computer and network. So what you need to think about privacy is, okay, if I have everything encrypted in the cloud, things are still going to be private, right? The only problem with this is that the encryption is going to be controlled by the cloud provider. So if you go to AWS and you upload some file to an S3 bucket, it is going to be encrypted by default. And that's great, because if you want to pass some benchmark, you can say, hey, everything is encrypted, and that's going to be looking great. The only problem is that the cloud provider, by default, controls your keys, and it's quite hard to be you, the one that is controlling all these keys. So everything you have there, everything that is encrypted, the cloud provider is controlling those keys. So you are not earning any extra privacy. You are not getting any privacy out of this encryption. Just makes sense. And also you will be thinking, okay, so I can access my stuff, AWS can access my stuff, but I know that AWS is not going to be sharing anything with any other company. Why, or government, why would they doing this? Do you really know all the agreements that AWS have underneath with governments or other companies that are interested in this data? I tell you something, I don't, but I'm pretty sure that there are some. So you trust as much as you want these cloud providers, but it's quite sure that they are going to be leaking all your information. And man, we are talking about companies that is uploading everything related to the company to AWS. They are just paying for give all this sensitive information to AWS, who can, well, share the information. And let's suppose that you are aware of all of this and you say, okay, well, I'm not doing this for privacy. I know what I'm getting into, but I still need this service because I need this service to be competitive in my sector. I need this service to develop faster, to go faster, and to be more secure. I have heard this a lot. I just gave you a talk about all the new entry points that open without closing almost any entry point from a traditional red team. Do you think cloud is more secure? Cloud is as secure as the guy that is managing this configures it. Most of the people that is using AWS doesn't know much about security. So no, in my point of view, at this point in time, cloud is not more secure. So you see the profits. Probably I'm not. I mean, I see the profits because I dedicate to this. But I don't know. I'm lacking some privacy, and I know there are a lot of companies doing this better. So maybe in the future we will see a more responsible cloud providers that allow you to keep your privacy, definitely. So this was the end of my presentation, and I just want to finish saying that I'm going to be releasing AWS hacking certification at the end of this year. So if anyone is interested about this, just contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.